and by the Myris. She was looked for through the streets as one lost. And one of the fellow servants of the doorkeeper told that she went out by night. And they examined the doorkeeper, and he told them that she was gone to the stranger unto the prison. And they went as he told them, and found her, as it were, bound with him in affection. And they went forth hence and gathered the multitude to them, and showed it to the governor. And he commanded Paul to be brought to the judgment seat. But Thecla rolled herself upon the place where Paul taught when he sat in prison. And the governor commanded her also to be brought to the judgment seat. And she went exulting with joy. And when Paul was brought the second time, the people cried out more vehemently, "He is a sorcerer! Away with him!" But the governor heard Paul gladly concerning the holy works of Christ, and he took counsel, and called Thecla, and said, "Why wilt thou not marry the Myris, according to the law of the Iconians?" But she stood looking earnestly upon Paul, and when she answered not, her mother Theoclia cried out, saying, "Burn the lawless one! Burn her, that is no bride in the midst of the theater, that all the women which have been taught by this man may be affrighted."
What makes a saint? Whether or not you often find yourself in church, we hear the word saint all the time in our general culture. I grew up in the American South, where it was not uncommon to hear someone say, "Oh, she's just a saint." Somewhat of a mixed compliment. These saints were usually women, most often mothers and grandmothers, and these saints of ours tended to be overburdened with a conspicuous amount of work in the community. Calling these women saints, therefore, reflected a level of concern as well about their well-being. There was also a degree of mystery about what these saints enjoyed in their free time, if they had any, and who they were before they took on the yoke of so much communal responsibility. The community where these saints lived were predominantly Baptist and Calvinist Protestant communities, and the whole idea of sainthood was generally under suspicion. There was a degree to which we were all super aware of our frailty and fallibility of our human state, and the whole idea of setting aside role models was just seen as a really difficult task. I grew up in this atmosphere of suspicion of saints, but nevertheless, the saints were always swirling around me. As a child, I would look across the street at St. George's Episcopal and St. Mark's Methodist with a mixture of jealousy and confusion. Who were these people that other Christians were lifting up? Why were they chosen? How were they different from you and me? I wondered what role the saints played in the lives of the Christians across the street. And now that I'm one of the Christians across the street, I still have many of the same questions. The concept of saints in the Anglican tradition in particular is one fraught with ambiguity and variety. Sainthood is a part of our faith that we are definitely still working out and building on. In many ways, we are always making saints. Not only are we choosing new individuals to remember, but we are constantly rethinking what makes a saint in the first place. Today is the commemoration of Thecla. Thecla, a woman and disciple of Paul, has been honored as a saint for practically the entirety of Christian history. One of the earliest saints of the ancient church, Thecla has been venerated on September 23rd for almost 2,000 years in the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox traditions. However, only last summer was Thecla added to our calendar of commemorations in the Episcopal Church. In fact, Thecla didn't even make it into the first calendar revision, published several years ago, but was added as a part of an effort to lift up more heroines of faith. So if Thecla has been remembered for so long by the Universal Church, why did it take us almost, 500-600 years to grant her an official place at our table? I think one possible answer has a lot to say about where we tend to listen for the voice of God, and how that listening shapes our ability to identify heroes and heroines of faith. As you probably noticed from our readings, we learn about Thecla and her faith from an important piece of early Christian writing that is not part of Holy Scripture. For some of us, listening for God outside the bounds of Scripture can be a scary and trying experience, if we allow ourselves to do so at all. For Anglicans, accepting the inspiration of traditional writings not found in the canon is a part of our faith that we have had to grow into. As we walk our middle way, the Via Media, historically we have tried to hold on to an intimacy with Scripture that can sometimes be lost when we add too much to the mix. Yet we have also grown to appreciate the nice slogan of our friends in the United Church of Christ, that God is still speaking. And for Anglicans, it has been important to go back and recognize that God was still speaking at Thecla's day as well, whether or not her witness made it into the canon. So, honoring Thecla not only becomes a way of honoring her individual faith, but it is also an act of recuperation of a larger Christian story that has to be discovered and pieced together into a patchwork of faith. We don't seek to overwrite or replace the Scripture that our ancient brothers and sisters chose, but instead we seek to reimagine Scripture as a living and breathing organism that has legs and limbs and veins that run throughout all time and in all places. Reading from the Acts of Paul and Thecla, for instance, breathes new life into our vision of Paul's ministry. We are helped to see a deeper picture of Paul's lively engagement with the issues of his day, as well as discovering a womanly example of faith that many of us had forgotten. If you turn again to your reading of the Acts of Paul and Thecla, you'll notice that the reading remembers Paul's ministry in a particular place, Iconium, and specifically its impact on the institution of marriage in that town. In the Acts, we hear that Paul has come to town and that not all are happy to have him in their midst. The accusation is that Paul is destroying the women of the town by convincing them to choose celibacy over marriage. Thecla is one such woman who was chosen to follow Paul and rejects her suitor named Thymiris. Thecla's choice earned her the title of lawless one and ruined daughter, and sent her entire community into a tailspin. How could this be the voice of God if it caused so much disruption to the social order? Thecla's community wondered. And I imagine many of us too wonder about the value of Thecla and other so-called virgin saints when abstinence and celibacy are seldom seen as collective virtues today. Particularly in the arena of same-sex marriage and the sexual liberation of women and LGBT communities, virginity, abstinence, and celibacy take on a different meaning. They often bring up memories of sexual shame and double standards for marginalized sexualities. However, in the context of 1st and 2nd century Greek culture, abstinence from marriage was a way for women to assert their freedom and make choices that differed from the dominant male householder. Yet, this freedom came at a price. The male household being the primary unit of social order in her culture, Thecla's rejection of marriage is seen as the ultimate form of blasphemy and warrants the death penalty. It is not Thecla's choice to teach and preach that is punished. Rather, the community punishes her for withdrawing from the model of family most espoused in her community. Most importantly, Thecla's faith shows us the degree to which the deepest held value in a community can turn on itself and become the spark that ignites the fire of hate. We learn how important disrupting the normal order of things has often been in order to hear the voice of God anew. To be sure, Thecla's sainthood teaches us that we are not looking for models of perfection, but for real people who courageously act to save us from the patterns that bind us. For many of us, family is everything. But remembering Thecla calls us to look at the ways that our most cherished affections can blind us to the needs of others and keep us bound to a smaller view of life than God would have for us. Remembering Thecla underscores that we make saints by ever expanding our vision of the household and family of God. We don't make saints by being good. We make saints by listening for God in other ways that might make us uncomfortable and ask us to look deeper at our own patterns of life. We make saints by emulating others who are often quite different from ourselves. We make saints by following the ever-elusive voice of God that is always expanding, moving, pushing through our short-sightedness and leading us into new life.
Ordinary person hears the voice of God, challenges the norm or the status quo. And for doing that, becomes a saint. Not by being good. Just helpful information. Did she learn?
Well, it's a complicated story to tell because it's clearly not really historical. At least there are parts of the story that aren't. And that they try to burn her, and supernaturally she doesn't burn up. And they try, and she doesn't. Yeah. So, but probably the part about her choice to refrain from getting married and following Paul is historical, and we see in the Paul reading, which would have been read in a Eucharistic service with the 2 Timothy on the first page. I mean, it just mentions the town and mentions the struggles that Paul had, and so there is some link to historicity.
Okay. Are you going to preach this?
I don't know. I just chose it because I was reading the book that the Episcopal Church puts out at our convention. It's called the Blue Book. And in the Blue Book, they added some saints, and I was going through there, reading them, and I said, "Oh, this would be a great thing to preach on." And September is an ordinary time, and ordinary time is often the time when other preachers get to preach. So I said, well, maybe if this goes well, I can do it. Right.
I'm just going to criticize your theology of saints, because I think if you preach this sermon in a lot of Anglican churches, a lot of people would disagree with you. Because I don't think there's Roman Catholic saints and Orthodox saints and our saints, and then they're all different. I've never thought of it that way. There's saints, and then people in certain countries have sort of national saints, because England, the Anglican calendar was sort of remembering more people in countries where there was more of an Anglican community, the same way Orthodox.
Right.
So
I
I
agree
don't
with that.
think,
Yeah.
but I mean, that's got nothing to do with the actual form of the sermon.
Sure.
But I thought it was really good.
Yeah, I was about to ask the same questions about what do you mean by saying saint? Because in my understanding, in Korean, just saint could be too divine for just ordinary people. So I just want to.
Well, that's the struggle. I mean, Anglicanism, we don't have a lot of things that are nailed down, so it's tough, and we definitely embrace the Protestant idea of saints as being all of us, and this idea that, the calendar is witness to the fact that we're always kind of picking people out to emulate. And I think I would say that most people, even though we have, we might not call all of them saints, that's why we kind of say commemorations and things like this. I think for probably a lot of people, they swirl in the same headspace,
A lot of people would say they were part of the Catholic Church
Sure.
with the history, and then there's people that maybe Rome hasn't recognized, and
It really depends on your piety. So it would have to be. I think the sermon might work at St. Gregory's. We have a lot of seekers and people who are new to Christianity, but also kind of want to figure it all out. And there would be people that, even though it's a fairly open congregation, would say, "Why are we reading something not out of the Bible?" They might not be opposed to it. They just want to know what's going on. So I did.
And what do you say what would you say in response to that question?
Well, I think that's why I included it somewhat in the sermon, that we're always trying to expand it and look for, I think in particular the Anglican tradition wants to kind of link up with as many Christians as possible, kind of going back and going forward and going everywhere and really bring as many people in and their stories in. We're not saying it's Scripture. We're saying that, hey, this was going on right at the time of Scripture, and some of it leads into Scripture, and this is helpful for us to know more about what the gospel really means.
I thought the tie to thinking about her as someone who resisted a sort of monolithic understanding of what family might be to current conversation, controversy, and all that cluster of issues. I thought it worked really well, and I had the sense, sometimes we can hear sermons where the contemporary issue and the ancient issue are maybe sort of in sync, but it seems not so natural and organic to move from one to the other, or maybe forced might be another way. But for me, the way you framed what she did in her hearing the voice of God and making a decision to choose a lifestyle that was not normative created a lot of anger among people, and the movement to contemporary issues seemed fluid to me, but I wondered how the rest of you experienced that.
An interesting sort of link that wasn't explicit in what you said, but that came to mind along those lines, was bucking the trends of family, which is also something that Jesus did. And so and I'm thinking within the St. Gregory context in particular, where they also have their own concept of saints.
Right, that's another thing.
Their own collection of saints, and some of which overlap with holy women, holy men, some don't. But that I think for people who are coming in asking, like, what is this about, and why are you doing this, and why are we reading this and not something from the Bible, and how does this all connect? That for me anyway was like, oh, and that's, if I had the need to sort of, if someone was like, but how is this Christian and how does it relate to Jesus? Well, right here, remember this whole conversation that Jesus had about who is my mother and who is my, ta-da, there you go.
Exactly.
Who's my family? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think that if I were to do this again or do it have more time, I think I would want to connect it to the gospel a little bit more. That wasn't my goal in this sermon, because I kind of wanted to. It's interesting. It was kind of blew me away when I first started going to some Anglican churches where they wouldn't even preach the gospel at all. And I don't ever want to. That's not my goal. But just kind of learning how to focus on something when you don't have a lot of time. But yeah, I would love to connect it more.
I thought your style was a really good balance for your intended audience. but also really good balance to these passages, because they kind of blow you away. Like, huh? She was what to him in affection?
Yeah,
It was like,
right.
whoa, okay. Yes. Oh, I see. She doesn't want to marry anybody. Okay, got it. You know, and I can, because I kept reminding myself, you know, you're at St. Gregory and this is a weekday and all that stuff. So in that sense, it really worked. I would have been really interested in how you would have drawn out Paul's side.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's just it's so rich, this story. And I thought, well, we're going to talk about Paul? They thought he was a sorcerer.
I love that word.
I know, it's like,
I was
yay.
like, oh my gosh.
Is that a good thing? No, I don't think so. They want to kill him now. Yeah.
It was empowering preaching on something other than the Bible, but not in a, but connecting it, you know, to Scripture, because it just, like you said, there's so I could do this again and say something totally different, or you know, so.
Yeah, we can do that for biblical text too.
Of course,
There's
yeah.
so different sermons
Yeah.
grow out of one biblical text. But it's interesting because preaching from a very, very familiar story, like a Good Samaritan or a parable that people really know really well, has its one set of challenges. And preaching from a story probably very few people have ever heard before has another set of challenges. Because you have to decide, you know, how much of this story am I going to retell? People probably just, we were reading it, and I don't know if that would be true at St. Gregory, they would have it in front of them in print.
They could.
But if they're just hearing it, how much of the intricacies of that they would have retained, you know, is a question. So you have to decide how much I'm going to retell.
Right.
Not being redundant, but because, you know, people may not have gotten it. And when you retell it, depending upon what the purpose of the sermon is, you retell it in a way that leads you to that particular purpose for this sermon, as you did with using the language if she chooses a different family constellation, or whatever that you said, would be language that, you know, most of us, because of the language you used, would have thought about LGBTQ family life and that sort of thing, even if you had not mentioned it. I think it was good that you did, but you used the kind of language that you hear in that controversy. And so it takes us there. Then you name it and it confirms it.
It's interesting that the first thing you said was prophetic, because when I was conceiving of the sermon, not that I didn't want it to be powerful, but I was thinking to myself, tame it. You know, I didn't want it to be super strong and super provocative. So that's interesting that it still came out, because I still wanted to say what I said. I just, you know, I can have strong opinions sometimes, and I don't want to. There was a reading we read earlier in the semester that talked about, you know, prophetic preaching being celebratory, not negative, and not berating people and things like that. And I want to move. I don't want to do that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, one of the things I want us to keep remembering about prophetic preaching is it's got many different sounds. It doesn't have to be loud and brash and whatever. It can be quiet, it can be thoughtful, but it leads people to ask questions about the status quo or oppression or who's being silenced in relation to that.
I remember in this class we talked about, you told us about the style can be different. It doesn't have to aggressively delivered. So I really liked your sermon because of the first is that I truly believe it's a transformation start at the personal level. It's ordinary people. It doesn't have to be people in the power. And the second, at first, this configuration was at first you said that few cross, but I happened to see far away, right? So I thought, my goodness, people like we are in a council. but it did work. It's probably definitely you disclose in the content magnet first is what makes sense. That helped one, and number two, the tone of your voice, the way you deliver, create really intimacy. Like I felt like we are in a storytelling group, in a small private hall like that. So I really like that.
It's a fun way to preach. I mean, it's in some ways it's confusing. You can't use your body in the same way. I mean, at least at St. Gregory's, there's the book that has scripture they put the sermon in. So you have a book. That's why I had a binder, and that kind of constrains you in terms of using your hands, things like that, which is maybe not. I mean, it's a limit, but a limitation. But on the other hand, I agree that that intimacy is kind of fun.
What do you have in the binder?
Just the
manuscript.
manuscript.
Because we talked a little bit about this when Laura preached her first sermon about the intricacies of preaching with the manuscript seated, and how it's interesting because this does create an intimate environment. But what would enhance that intimate environment would be to be as free from the manuscript as possible, as if you were just telling a story to a group of friends. And so I think what happens is, and you think about this with me, even though you're sitting, we notice the manuscript because we're sitting in a circle as if we are going to talk with a group of friends. But when we're talking with a group of friends, we're generally not reading the story that we want to tell. If we're standing at the pulpit, it is more expectant that we will have that. So we sort of have this clash of interesting dynamics. So it makes me wonder, at St. Gregory's, the priests there, if they're seated, they're preaching, what will they have? Will they have a manuscript?
Mm-hmm.
Usually.
Everybody always has, everybody preaches with the binder in front of them, whether it's a manuscript or an outline.
Okay.
Yeah, there are a couple preachers. John Galinsky will preach.
Sometimes.
In the earlier service, it's a much shorter sermon, and he will sometimes preach without a manuscript. And does a really good job of it. I think generally, though, they do a really good job of knowing the sermon really well, and they've done it for so long. And I think they probably include like spaces where that maybe it isn't written in. It's like, we'll tell this story or something like that.
Yeah, which we have talked about, gives you a lot of accessibility to the community.
I also wonder if there's no way to truly replicate the feeling of the room and the things that are in it.
Right.
I feel like the binder or having a manuscript in front of us here stands out more than there.
That
Because
could very well be
the
true.
scope of everything is so much.
And it's
That's
just
true.
larger too.
Yeah.
There's more things there, and it's
Right.
larger. So here it becomes.
And it's a holy book.
artificial.
It's basically our gospel book that a
Right.
sermon is inserted behind the readings. So it's a book that we've been carrying around the room and venerating and things like that. And so it's like reading
It's like holding
a book, and reading a story to a child.
gospel book.
Yeah. But at the same time, I think you're right that sometimes I notice sermons there that could be even more powerful, but there's a wettedness to the text that can kind of diminish it sometimes.
And is the preacher this close?
Almost.
Pretty much, yeah. There's a lot more people, but the rows go out. Yeah.
In your mind.
No.
No, Mike.
How many people? Must be good at Christmas.
150 usually at the main service during a weekday. When we have them, depends on 20, 30, maybe 10 sometimes. Depends really.
It's reminding me once I was teaching a preaching class, we were in the chapel, And there was a woman in the class who said, you know, I'm just so nervous. I'm just so nervous. She said, I want people to be really close. So she took the wooden lectern over there and she just put it just like a foot away from the front view. And about 3 sentences in, she said, wait a minute, too close. Way too close. No, I need some distance from you all. I'm kind of sweating up here. And so it's interesting how close people are, how people are seated. Those are important factors. The way the room is built to how people hear and what kind of relationship you can build with the listeners.
Also, this particular content, this closeness, really almost like a magnified the effect. It's because about the one person, almost like a person without name.
Right. Fictive person. Other things, either about the content or.
My favorite line was that we don't need perfection, but we need real people with courage. And that will stick with me for a while.
Would you say that was the essence of the sermon for you, or just something?
No, just something that's
Just something. What do you think the preacher wanted us to hear above all this?